So I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us today. I want to welcome you to our Introduction to Orton-Gillingham presentation shared as part of our Summer at Carroll speaker series. We will be recording today's event so that we can share it with you later. So if you'd like to ask us any questions at any point in the presentation, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation. While we're settling in, I invite you to participate in a poll that we're sharing in the Zoom window. We'd love to learn a little bit more about who is joining us today. While you're filling out those poll questions, I'd like to introduce our panelists. My name's Faith Blake. I'm the Director of Summer at Carroll. Here to tell us about the Orton-Gillingham approach and what it looks like at Carroll School is Heather Lufkin, an Orton-Gillingham Fellow and the Director of Carroll's Garside Institute for Teacher Training. We are also joined by Kristen Curry, Director of Admissions, who will help facilitate our question and answer session. We're also joined today by Jen Brock, Head of Product at Carroll School, who's here to help with Zoom and who's recording the session today. I'll give us just another minute and then we'll get started.
And Faith, it looks like we have some pretty nice distribution of attendees whose children are going to be in elementary and middle school in the upcoming school year. And we have a really even split between students who have had OG previously and this being their first experience. And about 90% of our attendees are going to be coming to Carroll this fall.
Wonderful, great. That's always good to know about our audience so that we can make sure that we're presenting in a way that you'll get something great out of it today. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. And with that, I will hand it over to Heather.
Thank you, Faith. We're excited to have all of you here this morning and hope that you're going to take away some wonderful information about Orton-Gillingham and how it is done here at Carroll. So I am going to share my screen and we're going to go through a presentation. As Faith and Jen have both mentioned, if you have questions, you'll put them in the chat and we will get to them as we can. All right, so let's start off. We are going to start off talking about Orton-Gillingham at the Carroll School. The goals and objectives of our time together is to give a very brief background on the Orton-Gillingham approach, to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the Orton-Gillingham principles. And if we have time, which we hopefully will, we're going to take a look at the Orton-Gillingham lesson plan here at Carroll at a wide glance. We're starting off with one of our favorite quotes here at Carroll. And this quote is attributed to Margaret Rawson and Robert Saunders. The differences are personal. The diagnosis is clinical. The treatment is educational. And the understanding is scientific. We are very privileged here at Carroll that we are able to see that dyslexia is a wonderful wide spectrum of children that we serve. The diagnosis is often clinical, but our treatment and our work here is on how we impact these children's educational experience. And then we are also fortunate that we are able to partner with other institutions to increase our understanding that dyslexia is neurobiological. So again, our focus for our discussion today is on the educational aspects of Orton-Gillingham. So we're going to do a very short synopsis, a little origin story on how Orton-Gillingham all started. Orton-Gillingham began back in 1925. This is one of the founders. His name is Dr. Samuel Orton. He was a neuropsychologist and actually worked in the Boston area, first with patients who had some significant stroke injuries, and then actually with children who had intact neurological networks, but were having difficulty with learning. And Dr. Orton first became interested here in Boston. He traveled out to Iowa, and when he was out in Iowa running a psychiatric hospital, he ran a mobile clinic for 2 weeks. And while he was out in this mobile clinic, he encountered a number of teachers and a group of boys who, by his accounts, were very bright, average to above average intelligence, but they were struggling significantly with reading and spelling. And this really started the hypothesis and the thinking of Dr. Orton. And what he began to contemplate was that this had nothing to do with intelligence, and it actually had nothing to do with vision. But what he thought it had to do with was the brain structure of these children, and that there had to be a better way to teach them how to read and write. And that is where the idea came out that the treatment would be educational. Dr. Orton traveled back east to New York, and here he met a number of people, but the two people that we talk about the most are Anna Gillingham and Bessie Stillman. Anna Gillingham had been an educator, a school principal, and a psychologist. She was highly interested in Dr. Orton's work. Bessie Stillman was her close colleague and a very highly respected educator. Together, they worked with the information Dr. Orton had developed and thought about how they could create an approach that would analyze the language and teach students how to read and spell. And so what they did was they started to develop an approach. They observed children, they observed teachers, they collected data, and they kept refining. This work was guided out of the structure of our English language, but it was also guided out of some key principles, which we're going to discuss today. They continued to train teachers all over the country, and their work, the Orton-Gillingham approach, is still considered to be the gold standard of reading, instruction, and intervention today. So to just frame our understanding, there's a lot of language often floating around. A lot of programs will claim they are Orton-Gillingham based, but we are an approach. So Orton-Gillingham is an instructional approach. It's intended primarily for use with persons who have difficulty with reading, spelling, and writing, of the sort that is associated with dyslexia. It's most properly understood and practiced as an approach, not a method, a program, a system, or a technique. In the hands of a well-trained and experienced instructor, it is a powerful tool of exceptional breadth, depth, and flexibility. And what I'd like you to take out of this is that it is an approach. And our goal here at Carroll is to always have it in the hands of well-trained and experienced instructors. We are very fortunate to have some excellent trained educators who can lead our children through this approach. At Carroll, we are constantly working and stretching to coach and work towards deepening our understanding of dyslexia and all of the teaching techniques that can assist our students. But our base is always Orton-Gillingham. So when people think of Orton-Gillingham, they often think of just the OG tutoring, or the focus area is what we call it at our middle and upper school. But in fact, it's a research-proven approach that offers this guiding set of principles that we use across all of our classrooms here at Carroll. So now we're going to do a quick breeze through. These are the main principles of Orton-Gillingham that we are going to discuss today. We are going to discuss direct and explicit, alphabetic and phonetic, diagnostic and prescriptive, multisensory, which is visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and tactile, structured, sequential, and systematic. We just like to call it simple to complex here. Cumulative and repetitive, the known to the unknown, cognitive, and emotionally sound and flexible. So after Dr. Orton and Anna Gillingham and Bessie Stillman developed their work, it continued on for many, many years. Carroll itself has been in existence since 1967. But what started to happen in the late 90s is that Congress started to wonder and question how children best learn to read. And so they convened a panel that looked at a depth and breadth of research to determine how children best learn to read. And the findings we often mention because this kick-started part of what we may all know as the science of reading today. And the findings were such. Good readers have 5 key components really solidly secured before they are reading. We often include oral language here at Carroll because we think that would be included now. We're going to go through some of these when we get into the lesson plan, but I'm leaving them here so you can just have a sense of them. Phonemic awareness or phonological awareness is being able to hear and understand the sounds in our language. Think of it as no letters, just hearing sounds and syllables. Phonics is the connections between letters and sounds. It's how children know that in a word like that, the A is going to say ah, because it has a consonant after. The phonics also impacts the spelling portion for our students. It's how they know how to spell the word take and that it has a silent E at the end. Fluency is a key component of reading instruction and good readers, and fluency is happening at the sound level, the letter level, the word, the phrase, the sentence, and the paragraph level. We do a lot of work here at Carroll around fluency. If students have strong phonological awareness, phonics, both for that decoding and encoding, and fluency, they were able to access the comprehension. Said a simpler way, if they can get the words off the page, they often are able to understand what the story is about. In addition, vocabulary plays a large role. We'll talk a little bit about morphology here at Carroll. We start morphology very early so that it's very direct and explicit, and our students can understand how words work together. So again, sort of big picture about how Orton-Gillingham started and big picture about where the research has begun from and continues to develop. Right, so now we're going to launch into the principles of Orton-Gillingham. The first principle, which you all probably know, is alphabetic and phonetic. We are teaching the structure of the English language. We begin with the simplest, looking at sounds, and we progress to complex words and text structures. So you'll see in these pictures here, this is a student working on her phonograms in the blue chart. Then she was slowly working on building a more complex word, engulf. And then to the right, you can see another example of words becoming even more complex, words with multiple syllable types, vowel teams. So this is how we progress. We are based on the alphabetic system because English is a alphabetic morphological system. The next principle of Orton-Gillingham that is near and dear to our heart here at Carroll is that it is structured, sequential, and systematic. We are teaching, studying, and learning the structure of the English language. We are constantly reinforcing these patterns. A prime example of this is what we do with morphology and vocabulary in the Orton-Gillingham lesson plan. So if you look to the right here, this is an example of a variety of structures we find in our language: verbs, nouns, pronouns, adverbs. In a very structured and sequential way, we teach students exactly what these are. We do the same thing with syllable types and syllable patterns in an Orton-Gillingham lesson. Orton-Gillingham is diagnostic and prescriptive. The easiest way to help people understand this is that we are continuously monitoring the verbal and nonverbal written responses that our students are giving out. We are taking copious amounts of data, and then we use that data to determine if we need to spiral back or if we need to move ahead. The way we often explain it to trainees is to say, We collect all this data and we make a diagnosis, just like you would when you go to the doctor. They diagnose if you have, a patch of poison ivy. They prescribe a course of treatment, which would be steroids, and then they continue to monitor. That is what we are doing daily in our Orton-Gillingham lesson plan. We are taking the data, we are sitting with that data and looking very carefully at it to determine if the student has reached mastery or if they need more review. And then in the next lesson plan, we prescribe a new course of action. This is what makes Orton-Gillingham an approach and not a program. On the right, you'll see an example of a lesson plan. The previous day error is listed for this student. Because the student was adding in an extra sound, the tutor has identified that they're going to incorporate it back into a section we called Phonological Awareness, and they've also incorporated it back into the lesson. And this is a word the student would read. We don't use the same words, but the same patterns, because again, we're trying to get the student to understand that the English language has a system. We cannot memorize the thousands of words, but if we know the systems, we can decode them. Orton-Gillingham is direct and explicit. I like to say there is no guessing here. We teach systems and we practice systems until the student has internalized them and made them automatic. On this slide, you'll see two examples. The slide on the left, called What's the System, is a very direct and explicit way we teach what we call a CK spelling generalization. We directly teach that when a student hears k directly after a short vowel in a one-syllable word, is usually spelled with CK. On the right, you'll see a student working on a word list and their phonogram cards up above. This lesson was on consonant digraph TH and short U. And you can see if you look closely at that word list, this tutor has incorporated TH and short U all throughout the lesson, along with some review words. So again, it is very direct and explicit, and it's spiraling back until the student is at mastery. Orton-Gillingham is cognitive. It's one of our favorite principles. Our students are encouraged to be strategic. We want them to recognize patterns and build reliable systems that they can use to decode and encode. It encourages them to think and reason rather than rely on rote memorization. As I mentioned before, there are thousands upon thousands of words in the English language. We cannot teach students to memorize all of those words because your comprehension is severely compromised. However, what we can do is teach them the systems and the structures that are in our language, and this enables them to access many more words. So in this photo, you're seeing a student working on syllable division so that she can divide up unfamiliar multisyllabic words. Orton-Gillingham is simultaneous and multisensory. We try to utilize all of the associations available to us: hearing, seeing, and movement, auditory, visual, kinesthetic, and tactile. By using all of these pathways, we create a stronger memory and neural network for our students. Here in these slides, what you're going to see, and throughout an entire Orton-Gillingham lesson, is the multisensory constantly being reinforced. So at the bottom slide with the B, many of our students have significant difficulties with B's and D's. We have a variety of different ways that we reinforce this. Some of the simple ways that are included is we use a little mantra called the bat hits the ball. We skywrite, we trace on sandpaper, we trace in sand trays themselves. If you look over on the right and you see the phonograms and the student working with the sand tray, you'll also see above the phonogram cards the pictures. We are constantly giving kids a visual cue to help them remember sounds, letters, patterns. Orton-Gillingham is emotionally sound. We set clear expectations. We give systematic instruction, but we often say here at Carroll, we move as fast as we can and as slow as we must in order for the student to internalize both the work and for them to understand that their effort is yielding a reward. So this is a picture of one of our current students, and you can see he was working on figuring out what's the system and for soft C, hard C, and also adding suffixes. So we always say it's hard work, but work that matters. And we try to bring to light to students all the time that their effort and work are important and have value and are moving them forward. Orton-Gillingham is structured, sequential, and cumulative. Another way to think about this is that we go from the simple to the complex. We go from the smallest to the greatest. The content is always organized logically, the most common to the least common. And again, we introduce it very systematically to our students, spiraling back again and again to ensure mastery. At the top, what you're looking at is a picture of a program we use here at Carroll School called Framing Your Thoughts. It's a great program to help with sentence expansion for written expression. As students learn how to create bare bones sentences, the dog sat, they learn how to expand them with predicate expanders. The dog sat on the dark wall. And we move from working at that simple sentence level into the paragraph level. And again, the same situation is happening in Orton-Gillingham. We're working at a very simple level, a closed syllable level, to a much more complex level with morphemes and roots. So it is always going back to working from the known to the unknown and the simple to the complex. This point, what we're going to do is take a little shift into what a typical Orton-Gillingham tutorial lesson looks like here at Carroll School. So we're going to recenter ourselves again with Margaret Rawson. And we're going to recenter ourselves on the sense that dyslexic students need a different approach to learning language than is employed in most classrooms. They need to be taught slowly and thoroughly the basic elements of their language, the sounds and letters which represent them, how to put them together, and how to take them apart. They have to have lots of practice in having their writing hands, eyes, ears, and voices working together for the conscious organization and retention of their learning. So to link back to what we've talked about already, Margaret is making the point that we must move as fast as we can and as slow as we must. We go back and shore up areas that are not solid or to mastery. We start with the basics and move forward because our language system, sorry everyone, my light went off. Our language system is based on this alphabetic principle and then increases. We have to work with our students to put the sounds and the letters and the syllable patterns together to read. And students in reverse have to work at taking them apart to spell. And the practice has to be multisensory. It has to involve our hands, our eyes, our ears, and our voices learning together so that there is a conscious organization. That's that cognitive piece we were talking about, and that there is a significant retention of learning so that we are not learning to familiarity here, we are learning to mastery. Okay, so now we're going to move between these two. We discussed briefly the Orton-Gillingham principles, which were direct and explicit, alphabetic and phonetic, diagnostic and prescriptive, multisensory, structured, sequential, and systematic, the simple to the complex idea, cumulative and repetitive, going from the known to the unknown, and cognitive and emotionally sound and flexible. These principles, as I've said, guide all of our work here at Carroll. This is what you see when you walk into an Orton-Gillingham tutorial. It's also what you see when you walk into a math class, and even what you see when you walk into a gym class. All of the staff here at Carroll is centered in these principles, making a significant impact in our students. And I often say they are, at its core, all of these principles are just good teaching. On the right side, what you'll see is a brief outline of what an Orton-Gillingham lesson typically looks like here at Carroll School. And we're going to go through each of the parts: phonological awareness, morphological awareness, phonograms, word building, words to read, fluency, oral reading, what says, this is the spelling portion, which has to do with sounds, SOS, spelling of words, and dictation, spelling of sentences and paragraphs. An easier way to look at it, sort of this horizontal view, where we have sounds, cards, the word list, the fluency, the reading, and then again, we shift into the spelling for the what says for spelling of sounds and morphemes, spelling of words, and spelling of sentences and paragraphs. We begin our lesson always with phonological awareness. There's a tremendous amount of research that at its core, dyslexia is a deficit in phonological awareness. Phonological awareness, again, is being aware of the sound system of our language. This is an example of one of the activities we typically do every day with students that reinforces the phonological awareness system and is multisensory. A student has a piece of paper similar to this and small manipulatives. So it's auditory and kinesthetic and visual. We give them a word and we ask them to split the word up into its phonemes. So for example, if the word was jump, the student would use the chips and drag them down and say j, p. One of the differences between Orton-Gillingham and other approaches is that we do a tremendous amount of Socratic questioning. The tutor might then ask what the vowel sound is, what comes before, what comes after, what kind of syllable type is this. So again, it's just getting them to listen to the sounds, but connect to that cognitive piece that explains the structure. The next portion of our lesson is we dive into morphological awareness. Morphological awareness at its core builds the understanding of word parts. We start this when students are ready to think about words and parts. It starts very early here at Carroll when we start thinking about a word like jumps. The student has to identify a base word and a suffix. It's starting to get them to think about the word usage and how prefixes and suffixes can change what a word does. In the end, morphological awareness assists them in reading, spelling, and increasing their vocabulary. But you'll notice there are no letters here. This is just, again, the sound system, getting them to think about the sound system. And the bottom picture, we always layer on here at Carroll School, is a student breaking a word into a prefix, base, and suffix. And then the tutor asks the student to segment the individual sounds in that base word. After we move for phonological awareness and morphological awareness, we've primed the sound system of our language, we move into what we call phonograms. Phonograms link the sounds of our language to the visual representations, otherwise known as the letters. What this does is it builds automaticity for our learners. We often find with our students that they need to overlearn their letters and their sounds at this level in order to be able to transfer it to the word and the sentence and paragraph level. We start with the most common and we build to the least common. We use keywords, which you saw those pictures, sand trays, skywriting, and other multisensory tools to help them unlock the letter name and sound and to hold it in their memory. So far we've talked about waking up the sound system, associating the letters and the sounds together, And then what we move into in our lesson plan is word building. Our students often sort our phonogram cards by concept. This is again an example of the cognitive piece. We don't just want them to know that PH says, we want them to understand it's a consonant digraph and how a consonant digraph is different than a consonant. So after the students have worked their phonograms and they sorted their cards for word building by concept, we take this opportunity to build words. This is direct and explicit. It connects the letters, the sounds, and the words. The teacher says a sound, the student repeats it, and has to locate the card that makes that sound and pull it down. They continue in this pattern. So I would say to you, what says? You would repeat and pull down the H card. They would go all the way to the end of the word, and then the tutor would ask them to blend that together, and the child would read the word. So we've gone from the sounds only to the sounds and the letters on individual cards. And now what we're doing is we're using those two systems to build actual words and to have a very direct and explicit conversation about syllable types and syllable patterns. After word building, we move into words to read, otherwise known as decoding or a word list. But what this does, it is where we work a lot of our main objective and we spiral back to old concepts. We work our list using auditory, visual, and kinesthetic methods. For example, on this word list, the student was asked to underline all of the vowels and say the sound. And so the student went through underlining each vowel. That's getting them to pay attention to the orthographic pattern and narrowing it down to the smallest part, which may be giving them difficulty. After they said each vowel sound, they went through and read all of those words, moving left to right. The other instruction the tutor would have likely have given would have been to circle the letter that makes the B sound. The student would have scanned visually again, locating the B's, circling, saying B, and reading the word. So again, we're getting students to pay attention, not just to the whole word, but to the tiny patterns within that word, reinforcing that sound symbol correspondence. And in this lesson, she was teaching them closed syllable. So when a vowel is followed by one or more consonants, the vowel says the short sound. But you can see she has a variety of consonants, consonant digraphs, and blends. Finally, a student reads this word list multiple times, 2 more times through, to develop that automaticity and fluency that the National Reading Panel was referring to. From there, we move into the fluency portion of our lesson. We work on fluency at the single word level, the phrase, and the sentence level. Here at Carroll, we assess the students, especially during the academic year, on bundles of fry words. These are the 1,000 most common sight words in our language. We also assess them on non-phonetic words. We directly teach the non-phonetic words for spelling, and we incorporate these in the fluency portion of our lesson plan, but often in many other parts of our lesson plan. So some of the examples you'll see here is you will see right in the middle with a ring. That is a quick ring card that a student will flip through very quickly. Tutors are always taking data, so they're tallying on the back how many times the child was able to read it automatically. If you look right below that, you'll see a picture of a snail, a bike, and a jet. The student was reading a variety of words. Some are phonetic and some are not. And they were reading them first as slow as a snail. So we're first working at that accuracy, going very slowly with club, jib, has. Then it's the same words again, a little faster as if you're on a bicycle, and then finally very quickly for that automaticity at the jet level. Farthest on the right, you'll see a picture of the word was and the mesh. Again, looping back to the multisensory instruction, the student would say the word was, then they would name each letter as they traced it and say the word again. We do this again and again and again to help students be able to read and spell these words. The last part of the front side of our lesson is called oral reading. We go through 4 different steps. So we go through 4 different steps for oral reading. First, the student is tracking and whisper reading it, and the tutor is taking notes to just observe. Again, back to Anna Gillingham and Bessie Stillman, observe what they're struggling on. It's giving the student a chance to work through the word. You will notice that our texts are often decodable. We highly control them. We only give the students things to read that we have taught them or we know are at their instructional level. The student then reads the text out loud to the teacher, tracking. The teacher uses some very strategic error correction strategies so that when the student makes a mistake, this is both for words to read and for oral reading, they have a consistent way to fix it instead of guessing. So they move through the student read with the teacher assisting when a word is difficult, and finally go into what we call the model echo read. The teacher reads, then the student reads the same thing. This is building that fluency, that prosody, that automaticity. And finally, the student reads the whole thing again by themselves. The steps can be laborious, but what it does do for our students is it gives them a chance to build the fluency and the automaticity, and it also gives them a chance to access the comprehension, which they're typically not able to access because they're working so hard to get the words off the page. After oral reading, oh, here's another example of oral reading. I wanted to show you 2 different types of books. Again, moving from the simple, closed syllables, to a more complex. And then we are very privileged here at Carroll. We have an amazing phonetic library. So these are just 2 examples, but we have many, many more that our students read. And when our students are ready, and we've determined that through a variety of assessments, we put them into trade books if it is appropriate for them. So the backside of the lesson, often referred to as the encoding or the spelling section of the lesson. What happens in what says is 2 different things. At the beginning level in Orton-Gillingham, we say to them what says, and we give them a sound. They repeat the sound. So again, there's the auditory. They name the letter that makes the sound, and they write it, which is the kinesthetic. This is a direct correlation to phonemic awareness and to the phonograms on the front side of the lesson. So you'll often see tutors tracking very carefully what sounds are tricky for students in phonological awareness, phonograms, words to read, and spelling on the back. And they'll go back to that simplest level. Can the student just hear the sound and associate the correct letter? When a student gets the wrong letter, it is written correctly in a variety of ways. We have some sand tray, some skywriting, some gel tracing. So what says at its simplest works at just a single sound level. It gets more complex when we start to say to students what says A, and we've taught them a variety of phonograms that say A. That's the cognitive piece they have to shift between A consonant, E, EA, AI, and AY. The other thing that happens to start in what says for morphological awareness is we work on prefixes, roots, and suffixes. So I will say to a student, what prefix do you know that means to do again? And a student will have to recall that the prefix re means to do again. The next part of the encoding portion of our lesson is called simultaneous oral spelling. For short, we call it SOS. The tutor says a word and uses it in a sentence, again, to build up vocabulary and to give some context for a student. Then they give a word again. The student catches the word, repeating it, which is both the auditory and the kinesthetic. And then what they do is they isolate each sound on the fingers. keeping their sounds up on their fingers, they write the letter while naming it, and then write it on their paper while naming it and read the whole thing. It's a very multi-sensory approach. It breaks spelling down into its individual sounds or patterns, makes it a lot more manageable for our students. If a student is having difficulty, we always go back to the sound system of our language because, again, that is predictable. The final portion of our lesson is called dictation. We do this both at the sentence and the paragraph level. The student is told the sentence twice by the tutor. The student repeats it, and what the student does is they place actually a token, or they draw a line in their notebook to represent each word. Again, going back to the auditory, visual, and kinesthetic. This is a visual reminder for them of how many words are in a sentence. The student independently writes this sentence without the teacher help. This is an excellent opportunity for us as practitioners to understand what they can do without our assistance. Thinking back to the oral reading, it's very similar. When they do their last oral read, we do not help them. We're trying to see what we need to spiral back to and what needs more practice. After the student has written the sentence, we use an editing approach called CAPS, which stands for capitalization, appearance, punctuation, and spelling. The student has an opportunity to do that on their own first. And then the student and the teacher work together word by word to identify the whole word and then each letter that makes up the word. And you can see here in this photo with all the arrows, the sentence was, Pete gave a ride to Mike. The student had a capital P, but he did not have a silent E. So the teacher and the student circled that word, and together they most likely fingered, spelled, or talked about the vowel, consonant, E syllable and wrote it correctly above. The teacher would then use this data in the next day's lesson plan to spiral back. And I'll stop there because that is sort of the end of what a typical lesson looks like. Again, it is individualized. It is based on where the student is, but that is a general overview of the principles and how the Orton-Gillingham lesson plan is delivered here at Carroll. And I'll open it up to Kristen, who will give us some questions.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was really wonderful to hear. I know from the questions that came in through the chat, I can tell folks have really enjoyed it. So thank you very much. I do have some questions for you that came in through the Q&A tool, and please feel free to submit others as well. We'll answer as many as we have time for. If we don't have time to answer your specific question today, we're also happy to follow up with you at another time. We get your name with your question so we can follow up with you by email afterwards if needed. Heather, one question that came through is, this was my first experience for my child getting Orton-Gillingham this summer. As a parent, how can I know if it's been working well for them?
So the good news is, as I mentioned, the Orton-Gillingham tutors here are collecting the data daily. So you'll have a conference with that tutor at the end of the summer, and you'll be able to ask that tutor, first of all, how they think it's going based on the data they've collected. You're also going to get a report at the end of the summer, which will summarize each of the parts of the lesson that I just went through and give you an update on where your child is and what they are specifically working on. For example, for phonemic awareness, maybe they can blend 5 sounds, and at the beginning of the summer, they could only blend 3 sounds. So I think the teacher reports and meeting with the tutors will give you the most information.
Thank you. How does Orton-Gillingham connect with any SLP support that my child may be getting?
So that's a great question, and I would say it's best answered by an SLP, which I am not. But what I will say is that because Orton-Gillingham works so heavily on phonological awareness and the sound system of our language, it connects very well to helping some students who have significant speech needs. An example would be if you have a child who has an articulation confusion between the F and the V sound, the F and the V. We are constantly building that back in phonograms. We use mirrors all the time to have the students look at their mouths. We have large discussions around what's your mouth doing, what does it look like. So many of those multisensory approaches are similar to what happens in an SLP block, but it's very child dependent because you may have a child who does not have an articulation need. The need may be something very different for an SLP.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions around what parents can or should be doing at home. There's a few weeks between when summer at Carroll ends and when the school year starts. Many families, do reading at home at night. Like, are there any tools or strategies you'd recommend parents try out at home?
Yes, so when you get your report at the end of the summer, there'll be a list of books that your child has read with their tutor. Those are books, as I said, that are often at their instructional or independent level. In the end, you want reading at home not to be an extremely frustrating experience for your child. There's going to be a number of books that your child is not going to be accessing at a decoding level because they cannot, in essence, get the words off the page. However, we often find with kids with dyslexia is that their comprehension is very strong. They're able to understand things if they don't have to work to get the words off the page. So what we often encourage parents to do is to do two different things. The first is to find an interest that the child might have. An example would be they like Greek mythology and they're in 4th grade. Read aloud the Percy Jackson series to them every night. If you're modeling, tracking with your finger as you're reading, you're reinforcing that left to right directionality for your child, and they're just listening to the story. They're able to connect about the characters and the events and the conflicts. So the first thing is the read aloud. If you're unable to do the read aloud because we are all very busy with life, the other recommendation we often have is to use Audible with the child having the book in front of them, or Kindle has a lot of great features where you can make the print really big. But something that's going to stretch their comprehension and vocabulary is encouraged. And then if you're going to read with them at home, we encourage you to read something that's at their instructional level. Their tutor will be able to answer that much better than I can. And I would say with that, it's in every other page situation. If they read a page and you read a page, or they read a sentence and you read a sentence, you want to lower the pressure. So they're practicing a book that they can access, but they're not feeling pressure to read the whole thing in front of you.
Wonderful, thank you. We had a question about where we see children just starting to make this really great progress, and they may not have an Orton-Gillingham tutor outside of summer at Carroll. Do you have any recommendations for finding someone to continue this type of work after summer at Carroll ends?
Yes, I think if you are looking for an Orton-Gillingham tutor, you can contact the Academy of Orton-Gillingham practitioners, which is sort of our certifying body here at Carroll. They're nationwide and they have a list per state. So that's probably a really good place to start. The other things that we often tell families is you can contact admissions, and you can send an email to Anne French through the gift office, and we'll try to help as best we can.
Sure. And I would just add that Anne French is able to take some information and post it out to many tutors. So I'm going to put her email address in the chat in just a moment to make sure that you have that as well.
Yeah, it's a great resources for families. And we, the people we have on that list are typically people we've trained here at Carroll.
Great. This question I can answer. Someone asked, since we're recording the webinar, will it be made available later? So yes, stay tuned. We will let you know via email when there's a way to access this recording, but we'll be sure to make it available to you all. Heather, could you speak a bit to the differences between Orton-Gillingham and Wilson, and the experience of a student who may go back and forth between those. So maybe they're getting Wilson in the school year, but Orton-Gillingham here at summer at Carroll. How does that work out?
Sure. So let me start with the first part of the question, which is the differences between Orton-Gillingham and Wilson. And what we often say here at Carroll is Wilson is a great program. Barbara Wilson, who created it, is an Orton-Gillingham fellow. Her goal was to get this into the hands of more public school teachers and more kids. It can work really well. It is designed to be group-based. And it all typically comes down to the training and the expertise of that teacher and the pace at which they're going. What I will say is that you have a child with mild dyslexia who's been identified early and has had a lot of intervention, Wilson can work really well. If you have a student who has more moderate to severe dyslexia, it's often not going as slow as it needs to, and it's not spiraling back as much to work to mastery. The second portion of the question was really about when students go back and forth between Orton-Gillingham and Wilson. So again, Wilson's based off of the Orton-Gillingham approach. We don't find children to have difficulty going back and forth between the two. The issue around the keyword is pretty simple to usually solve for us. We really use that as an aid to get them to unlock the sound, and so does Wilson. So it's actually just a couple of phonograms that have different keywords. And then really the rest of the way Wilson progresses is very similar to Orton-Gillingham.
Thank you. One parent asked us, do you teach each of these elements in every tutoring session, or are they addressed over the course of, say, a week?
So just for clarification, when we were looking at the lesson plan, do we go through that whole lesson plan in every tutoring session? And the answer is yes. So their morphological awareness, as I mentioned, we don't start until we've determined through some informal assessments a student is ready for that. But all of the other pieces of the lesson plan, we do go through on a daily basis because they all build on top of each other, and they all connect between the reading and the spelling. We're constantly trying to get students to see the connections between the two.
Great, thank you. Do you tailor the multisensory approaches to what works best for each student, or do you use all of these approaches with all students?
So the approaches I shared are often the ones that we find work best. We want the multisensory approach to be auditory, visual, kinesthetic, and tactile. There are certain ones we tend to find work the best with our students. That's not to say that there are not other ones that we haven't tried, but the ones I shared are we call our bread and butter. They hit all of the elements, but there are other ones. If a student is interested, back to that emotionally sound piece, if a student is highly interested, for example, in Pokemon, we may use that to write a decodable text for that student to engage them in their interest, which would work through that too.
Great, thank you. If a family lives in an area that does not have an Orton-Gillingham specialist or an Orton-Gillingham based school in the area, what would you recommend? Thinking in particular about remote support as a possibility.
Again, I think I'd have a conversation with admissions about that, and you could reach out to the Orton-Gillingham Academy. We don't have remote support here at Carroll. I'm sure there is some happening nationwide, so they'll probably be able to answer that in more depth.
Sure. And with my admission hat on, I can say that, we do have families that are looking for OT tutors who, for a variety of reasons, might be, needing to access remote instead of in person. And if you contact Anne French, there are times where folks will actually ask for a remote OT tutor through that list and can be matched that way. Much of the time, folks prefer that in-person relationship, but certainly we do see families ask for and find tutors who can work remotely when that's not possible.
And to piggyback on Kristen's, you can email the Academy. It's info@Orton-Gillingham Academy. I'll put it in the chat, and you can ask them specific questions such as that if you're not located here in Massachusetts, for example.
Thank you. Heather, does it help for parents to learn the systematic rules and partner with students on the learning journey? Or is it better for parents to maintain their role as parent and not teacher? And the parent is asking this from a social and emotional support perspective.
I think we all want to help as much as possible. Going back to that emotionally sound piece when we were talking about it with reading with your child at night, my gut reaction is to say you may want to read some articles online and find it interesting, but to leave the teaching of that up to the tutors and the teachers, because the language and their approach that they're going to use is going to be after a lot of study and coaching, and it may develop into a relationship with your child that would be less parent-child and be more teacher-child. So my gut reaction would be to not.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question today, but I do want to remind you, if we haven't gotten to every question in here, I know there's some great ones that we'd still love to connect with you about. We'll be sure to follow up with you after the presentation today. The last question for today is similar to the Orton-Gillingham and Wilson question, but could you address LIPS and Lindamood-Bell a little bit in terms of how it does or does not overlap with the Orton-Gillingham?
Sure. Trained in all those programs. So LIPS, like Wilson, is a great program. It's developed by some speech and language pathologists. What I would say about Wilson and LIPS is that they are scripted programs in the sense that you're going to receive a manual. It's going to tell you exactly what it thinks you should say, verbatim, actually, in the LIPS manual. Whereas Orton-Gillingham, as we've kind of reviewed a little bit today, is an approach. We are going to look at who the child is, where they are in their journey of reading. We're going to take a copious amount of data on them, and we're going to tailor it to that child. So that is a major difference between LIPS and Lindamood-Bell, Wilson, and Orton-Gillingham. Those are the big differences. And I would say here at Carroll, we're very fortunate where when we are training, we are able to train very in depth. So it's never kind of a short training here at Carroll. We really try to go in depth, and because we're able to have a coaching model, we're able to help practitioners.
Thank you so much. And I really want to thank everyone who submitted questions today. There were some really thoughtful questions in there. So we're really happy that you all could join us.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather, for that presentation. It was great to have it be multisensory for us with all of the examples and just really hearing in great detail about the Orton-Gillingham approach and the lesson plan. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today. And Kristen, thank you for joining us to help with the Q&A today. Thank you as well to Jen for helping us with the Zoom, all of the wonders of Zoom. I'm grateful to each of you for taking time out of your mornings to spend time with us today and to engage in the Q&A. And as has been said before, if you have any further questions, feel free to email summer@carrollschool.org, and we'll be happy to answer them or point you in the direction of someone who can get that answered for you. Just as a reminder, we'll be sharing out a recording of this webinar so that you can share it with loved ones, anyone else who couldn't make it today. And we really appreciate you joining us today. Thanks so much, everybody.